what do we do during interviews? Because it is one of the times that is just, it's an event that is absolutely set up to geared towards those unconscious biases. So how is we as organizations to set up our process correctly and ensure that our managers are trained to do this really well? So I appreciate you taking time out of your day. I'm super excited to be here. To give you a little bit of background about myself and what I do, I am an HR consultant here in the St. Louis market, although we have clients across the country. I've been in human resources for the past 20, I'm starting to think I need to redo my math. I might be getting closer to 30 years on HR experience at this point. But I came out of corporate HR. I worked in a small regional bank as an HR manager here in St. Louis, and then I went to Progressive Insurance, and I worked for Progressive Insurance for 15 years. And during that time, I was their director of recruiting for all of their claims and contact center positions across the country. And when I say they gave you my job title at one point when I left was Director of High Volume Recruiting. And I tell people all the time, if somebody puts high volume in your job title, you should probably run another direction. But in that role, we hired anywhere between about 8,000 to 10,000 people a year in our team. And it was across the country. And so one of the things we were constantly challenged with was we had individual managers in different locations with different understandings and experience around diversity and inclusion. So how do we help them even recognize that this exists, and more importantly, do something different in the interviews to ensure that we really were picking folks based on their experience and their ability to do the job, even if unconsciously we were making assumptions about people. And so this kind of unconscious bias training was key in really turning the corner and getting us to a place that we had a great understanding of how to pick the best people and how to even determine what that looked like. So I tell on myself throughout the course of all of my webinars because there is nothing more realistic than the things that we've done in our own lives. So one of the things I often ask folks when they're trying to wrap their head around unconscious bias is, do you have a food that you've actually never tasted, but it makes your nose curl and you're like, ooh, I would never want to eat that, even though you've never tasted it? That in and of itself is the core of unconscious bias. You've never tasted it, you've never experienced it, but you have an assumption about the fact that you might not like it or that you might love it, even though you haven't had it. This story for me goes back to, some of you will remember when they introduced blue M&Ms. And I would not eat blue M&Ms. I would pick every blue M&M out of the bag and leave it to the side. My husband loved it because he got M&Ms. I could buy a bag of M&Ms and he got to eat all of the blue ones. And he asked me one day, he's like, Katie, you do know that M&Ms, like the color doesn't impact the flavor. It's chocolate with a shell around it that tastes exactly the same. And I just looked at myself, I absolutely know that. Like my brain knows it, I'm well aware of it. I cannot eat a blue M&M. That's not what they're supposed to look like. And so I continued to pick out the blue M&Ms. Over the years, apparently my love for M&Ms grew enough that I finally sort of ventured in and I tasted blue M&Ms, and turns out my brain was right. They taste the same as a red M&M and a green M&M. But my brain had a filter on it that said blue M&Ms must taste bad, and it was hard to push past that. For other folks, this comes down to, for my father, this was broccoli, anything green. There's all sorts of, I have all sorts of weird food issues that are clear that if I lived my life with as many biases as I have around food, I probably would be making all sorts of assumptions about people that would be getting me into trouble, particularly in the interviewing space. So if you think about and you simplify, it takes a really complex concept and simplifies it, but I often find this resonates with folks. I'm not a bad person because I didn't like blue M&Ms. I wasn't doing something horrible. I didn't like them and I had assumptions about them. Whether that was intentional or not is kind of a different decision-making process along the way. But the key is these things exist. Now this is one of my favorite slides. When I put this up on the screen, think about for a moment, what were the first 2 or 3 words that kind of popped into your mind? And what were the reactions that went through your brain? Now, for many of us, the things that came to mind were bank robber, mugger. Now, I can tell you, Molly, who's on the phone, is from Wisconsin and lived in Minnesota before that. So Molly's my perfect example. Molly might see this and go, well, it's cold outside. I see this living in St. Louis, and I am getting the heck out of Dodge. There is no way I'm sticking around to find out what might happen next. Again, it's a bias that we have that this mask signifies danger or something bad about to happen simply because of the experiences that we've previously had in our life, where on television, this is what a bank robber wears, so something bad must be about to happen. And as we go through life, there's all sorts of examples of things that somewhere, whether it be somebody told us or we heard something, or maybe just we've never had exposure to certain things, our brain starts to filter things and we have to weed out some of that information, but it forces us to draw conclusions that may not necessarily be accurate. So I want you to take a moment and take a look at this picture for me. And as you look at the picture, I want you to be looking for everything in the picture that is pink. I'm going to leave it up here for about 15 seconds, and I want you to look for everything in the picture that is pink. As much as you can possibly find, think about, list them out, write it down sort of in either mentally or on a piece of paper. What are all the things that you see that are pink? I'll give you a couple more seconds. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a couple of key questions about this picture. First of all, what was on the floor at the foot of the bed? Barb, your facial expression on that one was priceless, so thank you. Number two, what two items are on the dresser at the foot of the bed? Number three, what's on the floor in front of the window? And number four, what two items are on the bed? Now, some of you may have gotten a few of those correct. Others of you are thinking, I don't think I was even looking at the right picture. Rick, thanks for the facial expression, because I think you might have been in that bucket based on it. So let's talk a little bit about why that is. So just so for those of you who get frustrated if you don't ever actually find out the answer, what's on the floor at the foot of the bed is actually a panda bear. It was a small black and white panda bear at the bottom of the screen. What two items are on the dresser at the foot of the bed? There was a lamp and a picture frame. And then what was on the floor in front of the window? There's a vase with some flowers in it. And finally, what two items are on the bed? There's actually four items on the bed. And some people will get this because two of them were pink. There was a blanket and a pillow that were pink. There was also a phone and a computer. And if you want to see it again, because sometimes it really drives people crazy that they can't see those things, this is the picture that you looked at for 15 seconds. And yet the major items in the picture you may have missed. So the question becomes, what made you miss those? Why didn't your brain see them? The reality is, as I told you to look at the picture, I told you to look for everything pink. I gave your brain a filter to look through. And when we do that, when we have that filter in front of our eyes, it is not our fault. We're not doing it intentionally, but our brain then has to sort through all of that information and focus on whatever it is I told it to focus on. And so the things that you pulled out of the picture reinforced there's a lot of pink things in this picture, and started to weed out the fact that there's things in this picture that aren't pink and you didn't pay attention to them. This is really the key concept behind unconscious bias. Unconscious bias means at any given point, if we didn't have unconscious biases, first of all, let's be clear, our brains would explode. There's too much information as human beings coming at us, too much sensory items coming at us on a daily basis, that if unconscious bias did not exist, our brain could not handle the amount of information coming through it. So it's not good or bad, it just is. But the reality is, if we don't understand what filters we have and when they might be applying, we can't cut through them to recognize that while my brain is telling me something, my brain may be telling me that blue M&Ms just don't look right, the reality is that information isn't correct and I shouldn't be using it to make decisions. Same thing goes in the case of the pink picture. Just because our brain is telling us to look for all things pink, we're only reinforcing our assumptions. So especially in interviewing, we have to think about what filters are we going into each and every interview with, and they'll differ by interview. And then understand, how do I gather information during the course of this conversation that helps to combat those assumptions, or at least test them, so that I don't make decisions based on things that aren't appropriate. So if I'm walking down the street in Minneapolis and it's, there's 12 feet of snow and it's 30 below outside, and I see somebody with a ski mask, I don't just hightail it the other direction, because I'd probably be constantly running into people with these ski masks on. But in St. Louis, if it's 80 degrees outside and somebody walks down the street with a ski mask on, you should probably raise a question and wonder what's about to happen. These are the kinds of things that we have to retrain our brain. And the only way to do this is to spend time really understanding what are our unconscious bias. And these will be different for every single person. And the only way to really understand it is to start to filter down and take some time to self-reflect. So this next exercise that I want you to take a look at is a picture of several different financial advisors. Let's assume you're hiring a financial advisor for your organization. So you are picking the next financial advisor, you're in a financial firm, and you're making the next hiring decision. And these are the individuals that show up to the interview process. Based on this, which of the individuals would you hire as your financial advisor? And if you think about just the quick decisions, there's no right or wrong answer here. You know nothing about these individuals. But the reality is, you probably came to a judgment really quickly. There were people that you ruled out, and there were people that you ruled in because in your mind, they looked like a financial advisor. What's really interesting is when we do this exercise in live sessions where folks can vote and provide all sorts of input and conversations, often what I will hear, I never get the same answer. The only answer I ever get that's always the same is Paul down here, number 4, never gets hired as a financial advisor because folks feel like he looks a little bit like a used car salesman. So they won't hire Paul for the financial advisor. Sometimes they will hire candidate number 2 because he looks casual enough that I might be intimidated about talking about my finances, but this feels like somebody I can connect with. Other times, candidate number 1 and number 5 tend to be, especially for females, they tend to be my most common selections for our female crowd. They look like somebody you could trust with your money. They're dressed the way you would expect them to be dressed. All of these things, when you're faced with that first initial impact in an interview, reflect how quickly our brain makes those kinds of decisions. Now, here is one of the stunning pieces of information that always kind of takes folks aback when we talk about interviewing and just unconscious bias in general. And that's this concept that we make 11 judgments about someone in the first 7 seconds that we meet them. 11 judgments. Think about what you've done in the first 7 seconds of an interview. You've probably seen the person. Pre-COVID, we would have shook their hand. We've probably assessed their clothing and maybe even assessed whether or not they actually were on time. And maybe we've said hello or talked about the weather and getting some basic information from. So, but that's really kind of the core of the concept here, is think about how quickly this happens. Now, what's really interesting in interviewing is, in addition to those first 11 seconds that I meet someone, the resume before I meet them makes an even bigger impact. So that time period that I am reading a piece of paper makes a huge difference in the assumptions I make about the person who is about to be coming in the door. We used to do this quite a bit at Progressive. We would run calibration exercises with managers from different divisions, and we would send out resumes, 10 or 12 resumes, to a group of managers, and we would get on a Zoom call and do polling. And in that polling, we would say, would you hire this candidate, yes or no, and why? And it was always so interesting to hear them talk about their why. They had built stories around these folks based on this piece of paper that you are like, what piece of paper are you looking at? Because they don't see that. Sometimes we would take names off. Sometimes we would leave them on. And it really, sometimes we would switch them up just to see if we could have some fun. And it really did make a difference. Because as humans, again, that piece of paper, that resume, is a filter for us. That's an important piece for us to know. Here's the next layer to this that's important when we think about those 11 judgments in 7 seconds. More commonly than not, our stereotypes that we have, that we make in those 11 seconds, are negative versus positive. So we often think of unconscious bias and we think, well, that means I thought something bad about someone. And actually what I found a lot of times in interviewing is we have positive biases, right? If your best employee sends you an employee referral, you're quick to be like, oh, this one's going to be amazing. If you've historically hired veterans into a role and they've been successful, you see that resume with a veteran on it and you're like, oh, this is going to be great. You have both positive and negative stereotypes of individuals. It's just the fact of life. But the reality is when we do exercises with managers, percentage-wise, when we think about, there's a great exercise we do in the full workshop where we have people write down all of the stereotypes they've heard or ever run into or ever even thought themselves for different categories. Sometimes we'll do a man over 60, sometimes we'll do a Black female in her 20s, sometimes we'll do somebody with a Southern accent. And almost always, folks will make their list of the stereotypes they've heard, and more of them are negative than positive. And it doesn't really tend to matter which of those stereotypes we start talking about. So it's important that we keep this in mind when we think about the resume that we're looking at and the person we see in those first 11 seconds, we've already sort of put those filters on that make a difference. So the key is, how do you set your interviewers up for success to ensure that they recognize those filters, and then they have the tools to make sure we're never going to stop the 11 judgments. It's just not going to happen. But how do we recognize when they come into play? And then use the interview process to really collect enough information to make the right hiring decision, not based on those assumptions or those stories, but instead based on the information we get from the person and what we learn about them. And that's really the critical part about changing your interview process and taking a new perspective on this. It's interesting as we do when we do this as a full workshop, we actually write scenarios that are specific to that client around the different types of roles that they hire for and situations that they tend to run into. And sometimes they'll tell us, oh, the bias is around, you know, the type of whether or not somebody has a degree, or the bias is around where they went to college, or for those of you who are in St. Louis, what high school did you go to? All of these different types of pieces. And so we'll write these scenarios and we'll put them out there, and we intentionally write them where, like, you can't tell if it's a male or a female, or you can't, you know, there's so-and-so's, your best employee referral. And what we find is when we start debriefing on these scenarios as to whether or not you would hire people, again, just like the resume, they have filled in so many pieces of information that all of a sudden you realize, wait a second, none of that was actually in the story we gave them. They've just added on to it based on those filters that they've applied. So here's the challenge when it comes to interviewing. So many of us, when we are interviewing, sit down and think, what do I ask? And then they go, well, even if I know what questions to ask, how do I know if I get the right answer? And it really turns the whole thing into kind of a crapshoot, for lack of a better word. You're rolling the dice because we haven't thought about what is it I'm looking for, and then how do I assess whether or not this person has those skills and abilities. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we run into with clients, is they start their interviews with things like, tell me about your strengths. My favorite, with 20 years in recruiting, I truly thought this question was a myth. And then I got an interview guide from a client when I first started my consulting business, and it actually had this question. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? And I seriously picked up the phone and called a former colleague, and I'm like, we've heard it existed, but we didn't really think it was true. It does exist at places. The other piece is sort of when we lead with, well, accuracy is important. Are you detail oriented? Well, what is somebody going to tell you? They're going to tell you exactly what they think you want to hear. And this is where interviewing falls apart, because all we hear is the information that we've been feeding to a candidate, or that reinforces the assumptions that we made based on our unconscious bias. Is change up our questions, because here's what you're going to get. If I ask what your strengths are and somebody says, I'm a people person in the interview, you might find out you get this when they walk into the job. Somebody who's yelling at your clients and maybe not handling things as well as you'd like them to. The other thing we get if we don't assess competencies is somebody can tell us, I'm extremely organized. And yet this is what their office ends up looking like. And we've all had that interview experience where what they told us in the interview is not exactly what we thought. So behavioral interviewing is the tool that is so critical to this. It's this concept that by asking individual about how they've handled things in the past, we can predict how they will handle things going forward. And by actually getting them to tell us about the stories of their experiences and sharing with us what their actions are in those moments, we can now see what their natural tendencies are actually going to be going forward. And when we do this really well, we ask them specific examples of the kinds of things that they're going to need to be able to do to be successful on this particular job. And so the questions that I might ask somebody if I'm hiring an accountant are going to look very different than the questions that I might ask somebody that I'm hiring to be a customer service rep. But we still take the same approach regardless. We just change the questions because we've thought about, what do I actually need this person to do well? So let's talk a little bit about best practices. The first thing you need to do when you're hiring for a position is start by defining the competency, skills, and motivations. And this sounds really basic, right? In theory, we look at that and go, well, of course, Katie, that was silly. You would be amazed at the number of times that when we kick off recruiting for a client on a new role and we say, so tell us what it looks like when somebody's really good at this. What are the key competencies? And they stop and they kind of look at me through Zoom and go, well, that's a really good question. And yet their question right before that was, can you get me an interview by Wednesday? And I'm like, well, wait a minute, we haven't even decided what this person needs to be good at. So we have to start by thinking about these competencies, skills, and motivations. So what is a competency? A competency isn't necessarily something you can see from a resume. A competency is really about, does this person, say, have customer focus? Are they good problem solvers? Are they good at critical thinking? Are they coachable? Are they quality oriented or safety oriented? So they're really about the skill sets and behaviors this person demonstrates. On the flip side, motivations are really about what gets this person jazzed about getting up and getting to work every day. This is one of the most simplistic diagrams you will ever see on interviewing. And yet every time I do an interviewing skills class, when I ask at the end, what was their big aha moment? I laugh. It's always the picture with the smiley faces. So here's the concept behind the smiley faces. When we think about a role, we have to think about what does a person spend a lot of time doing and what do they never get to do? And then in the interview process, your goal is to ask the person a series of questions that helps you understand what do they like doing and what do they dislike doing. And if I like doing something and I'm going to get to do it all of the time, I'm going to be really happy and I'm going to be engaged at a higher level. If I have to do something all the time and it's the thing that I hate, I'm pretty much going to be miserable on most days. And I might gut it out for a while, but not for very long. It's interesting, sometimes I will find clients who they fall in love with a candidate and because they were hiring for, say, starting out with a sales role. And somewhere along the line during the interview process, things shift and they needed somebody, they really liked the candidate, but they decide, you know, this job is a little less of a sales role and it's more of kind of an account manager, customer service role instead. There'll be a little bit of upsell, but not a direct sales role. Well, they hired the person because they really liked them when they interviewed them as a salesperson, but they didn't go back and think about, well, if this person loved being a salesperson, but you take that away from them and now they never get to do this thing that they love, they may not be happy anymore. And so while they even might convince themselves they're going to enjoy it, eventually that burnout will set in. And so this is something you want to unpack during the interview process. Now, you may be asking yourself, Katie, what does that have to do with unconscious bias? The reality is you'll often hear somebody say in an interview, like they just weren't a good fit. I can't put my hands on it, but like my gut just didn't feel right. That is one of two things. First of all, it's either your unconscious bias putting a filter in place that you're having a hard time coming past, or there's really something about this motivational fit that you sense and you know it's there and they shared things with you, but you're having a hard time putting a name to it. And that's why doing this exercise before you ever start an interview process, before you ever read a resume, putting this down on paper is so critical, because now when you get done with the interview and you're like, there was something, but I can't figure out what, now you have that piece of paper to go back to and ask yourself, was this because they were missing a competency? Was this because maybe it wasn't a good motivational fit? Or do I have a filter in place that's keeping me from seeing what was really there or what the potential for this person is? So it gives you the tools you need to be able to be sure that your unconscious biases aren't unintentionally impacting your outcomes. So when we talk about predicting future behavior, it's all about getting stories from the candidate. And it's not filling those stories in for them. And most importantly, it's not really even about the what was the situation part of the story. Instead, we want to ask questions that say, tell me about a time. Tell me about a time when you missed a deadline. Tell me about a time when you went above and beyond for a client. And tell me what you liked and didn't like about your last job. This last one's going to start to get to motivational fit. Again, when we get somebody sharing their past experiences with us, you can prep for that interview in terms of taking time to think about what your past experiences are. But it's really hard for folks to make up those stories, especially as a good interviewer. You should be asking for more than one example. They might have one really good example, but if they're making them up, they probably don't have 2 or 3. So when you ask the question, we said at the beginning, you have to know what you're going to ask, and then you have to know what you're listening for. When we're listening for the right answers in behavioral interviewing, we're really looking for what we call the STAR. This is the situation or the task. What was going on? Now, many of us, both on the interviewer and the interviewee side, get really caught up in, tell me more about the story. The story really just sets the stage for you, and actually is where you should be spending the least amount of time in your interview. Instead, what we care about is this action component. This piece that says, what did the person do when faced with a situation similar to the one they're going to have here? What steps did they take? If it's a customer service question and you say, tell me about a time you went above and beyond, there's a big difference between the candidate that says, well, the customer needed me to make an exception and I went to my manager and asked. And that's their version of above and beyond. Versus the candidate who goes truly above and beyond and helps that customer get the outcome that they need and get a creative solution maybe even to get there. And most importantly, hopefully treats them really well in the process. So this is where you want to spend the bulk of your time really digging in and understanding what are the steps they actually took. We're going to talk at the end about a tool that we use called Interview Path that helps build these interview guides for you so that you can pick out the competencies that are important for the job, and then it gives you the questions you need to ask to help you get at those competencies. And even better, it goes one step further to give you definitions of what does it look like, what do those behaviors really look like when the person's taking the actions that support the competency you need for the role. Now we're starting to apply some science to a practice that, quite honestly, interviewing is a little bit of art and a little bit of science, and sometimes it's a little bit more art than it is science, and that's why unconscious bias becomes challenging. But when you do behavioral interviewing, you bring up the level of science and you put a lot more structure into the organization so that you start getting quality hires. So it does great things in terms of your diversity and inclusion, and it helps you on the quality side of the house. So there's a couple of best practices beyond just doing the interviews, and I talked about one of them, and that is leverage technology. If any of you have ever sat down and tried to create interview guides, while it sounds really easy to come up with a list of questions that start with, tell me about a time when, it actually can be rather time consuming. There are technologies out there like Interview Path that is an amazing tool on a really great budget for small to mid-sized organizations that will create these interview guides for you, and you can customize them for all of the different roles that you may be interviewing for. Even if you only have 1 or 2 roles, you can, we've done this for clients where they're like, Katie, I don't need a ton of guides. I've got 2 roles I need to interview for. Have somebody create those interview guides for you so that when your managers do go to interview, they've got a starting point. And then most importantly, train your interviewers. Even with a guide in hand, if they don't understand the concepts of behavioral interviewing, now they just have a different set of questions, but they don't understand what it is they're actually looking for. And most importantly, the piece that they miss and the value that we really find people get out of interviewing skills training is understanding the follow-up questions that you have to ask. On a fairly regular basis with some of our clients, I've had a few who haven't yet been through our, they're a newer client, they haven't been through our interviewing skills class, and I know that I'm sending them a guide, and yet they've never actually done this. And I feel like I'm only giving them like half of the equipment that they need to go out on the football field. So I have offered up to conduct an interview with them, where, especially in Zoom world, this is really easy because we can all get on a Zoom call. I can ask the questions and they get to just listen to the answers. Because oftentimes interviewers are more nervous than the candidate, to be honest. They don't know what they're supposed to ask. They're scared of what they can't ask. And they can't quite figure out why something's not sitting right, but they don't know how to go any further. I've interviewed a lot of people in my career, more than I could even begin to count. And it's really easy to interview when it's not my job to hire for, because now I'm focused on, am I asking enough follow-up questions that somebody else could make a decision based on the information they're getting? And am I getting them a broad enough picture to understand the pros and cons of this candidate? So if I hear something that I think, ooh, that might not sit well, I am thinking in terms of, let's get them some counter information that helps balance that out in case that's not really what the candidate meant. I did this last week for a client, and it was really interesting. We were interviewing a candidate they were in love with. He had 90% of the competencies that they needed. The one piece they weren't sure if he could do was really take a profit and loss statement and translate that into, hey, here's what's going on the P&L side, so here's the resource decisions I need to make in terms of our maintenance crew. And so I had used the interview path. I created several different competencies around this concept of resource management, business acumen, and really the decision-making, critical thinking piece of it. And in each case, I went at it from a perspective of, tell me about a time you used data to make decisions, or tell me about a time you used the financial reports to make a decision. This guy had 30+ years of experience in this industry. And he could not come up with an example, regardless of what angle I tried to kind of feed it to him to get him there. When we finished the interview, I said, he is a great candidate, and there's probably a lot of roles, but if this is the component you need, he's not done it previously. Now, it's coachable, so it's something you can learn, but they walked away and said, wow, in that moment, the manager said, there's no way I would have gotten that set of information from the questions I was asking. And so I think it's important to remember, when you have the right tools and then you train people the right way, the differences that you get out of folks is just amazing. And more importantly than just getting different information, which is key, take it one level further. All of that information, when you're focused on, I really am here to get to know this person, what you're saying is, I'm going to leave my unconscious bias at the door. And if I feel that coming on, then what I'm going to do is make sure that I take the time to look for contradictory information and make sure that I really get to know the candidate themselves. All of those tools are really at the heart of unconscious bias in interviewing. The training is fun, it's super exciting. I will tell you, this interview path project technology is one that I've been really impressed with. I came out of Fortune 100 world, and we had an interview guide system there. And I really sort of lost sight of the fact that in all those years of corporate world, you forgot that small businesses often can't afford those large technologies. And so when I came out of that and started in consulting space, I was like, wow, I'm actually building interview guides for clients because they need something. And Interview Path actually has taken that space. And the cool part is, even for our small clients, the gentleman that wrote the Interview Path technology came out of recruiting at American Greetings, and he knew exactly what he was trying to accomplish, and he did a great job of doing it. So we're always happy to share their information with folks because it is such a great technology. And I see our clients using it on a daily basis to make a difference in the decision making of their interviewers and just the conversation around unconscious bias in general.